All right, I think for today we'll get started. I was recommended at the beginning of these videos to mention the date, so today is March 7th. I've wondered a little bit more if it would be helpful to put it in the title of the YouTube video, but we'll see about how best to do that. The titles, if they get really long, sometimes are kind of challenging to find. So it was actually a little bit harder to find a picture of the martyrdom of Stephen that I liked than I expected it to be. I can't remember why I chose this one, other than lots of other ones were not my favorite paintings. This one I think is a later painting because one of the saints in it, who I think is in the white cloak, is a medieval saint of some sort. I wish I remembered all these things. Like, I looked it up and I thought, oh, that sounded interesting. And it was a nicer painting of it. Sometimes I'm not a big fan of the Spanish school. So if you see Spanish paintings, the people tend to look fairly skeletal and dark, like pale, ashen-colored skin. It's, I think there's a painter named El Greco who's a Spanish painter, and if you see some of his works, that's kind of the Spanish influence, the Hispanic things. I tend not to like that quite as much, so I pick other ones. When you lead a Bible study yourself, you get to pick your own art. I'm sure that's the part that's holding you all up. It's the art that you have to pick. It's often just a Google search, and I start looking through things and eventually find one that I like. But I think Father Rost asked a question for me the other day, and I thought it was a really good one. It's not on the list, but he said, what does succeeding in Bible study look like? Like, what is the purpose of doing this? And that's something that I don't know if I have a good answer for yet. I have to think about it. Because part of it, I think, is definitely to study the Bible. Part of it is probably because we all enjoy it. I enjoy teaching it. You guys seem to enjoy coming. It sounds like you don't want me just to stop suddenly leading Bible studies. I do think that encountering the Scriptures is encountering the life-giving Word of God. And that is important. That the Word of God has an ability to speak to us, has an ability to move our hearts, has an ability to change us and communicate the grace of God in a way that lots of other good things don't. That sometimes it seems like of all the words written in the Bible, there's something in it for us. There's some piece where it's like, God wrote this for me today. How did he know? It was written some 2,000 odd years ago, give or take, and yet many of the words have that kind of living and effective power for us. So that's part of it. But I do think that part of success for this also looks like you guys deciding to take up some of it on your own. I mean, one of the ways that I would say it's been successful is if you learn to feel like you can study the Bible yourself, like you could invite friends over, that this is something you could do. Some of you would say, well, we could never lead a Bible study like you do, and I think that's true. But you don't have to lead a Bible study like I do. Like, I do it this way, partially because of the School of Hard Knocks and partially because I've learned a few things over the years. But a lot of it are my preferences. I make tea because I think It's kind of fun, and it's good to expose you to exotic things. Helps you remember that North Dakota is part of a bigger world. And that there are a lot of things that I think we're very blessed in our modern world that previous generations weren't. I think I heard some tables talk about, 60, 70, 80 years ago, Catholics didn't really study the Bible like this. They certainly didn't take a long slog through the text and dig through the meaning and allow it to speak to them in the same way. It was like, studying the Bible was maybe what the priest did, and then you listen to the priest on Sunday. And I think that's a gift that we have, that Catholicism never should have compromised on reading the Scriptures. There was a time where it was like, no, the Scriptures were Protestant, and I don't know how people held that. I don't know how priests thought of that. There's a lot of questions I would like to ask priests from 60 years ago. What exactly they were thinking, or not thinking, as it were. But I think we're very blessed to live in the world that we do. I mean, even, you think about the pandemic, and there was a lot of it that was definitely a challenge. But thank goodness that it happened at a time when the advent of the internet was at a point where you could video chat with people. Lots of you came out of the woodwork and learned how to video chat with grandkids and do some of those kinds of things in ways that you probably wouldn't have done had you not been forced. And there's a blessing to that. I mean, we live in a world, you think about the apostles and Philip today, and Philip gets transported by the Holy Spirit. I wonder if it's like Ezekiel, where Ezekiel says the angel grabbed him by his hair and yanked him all the way to Jerusalem. Might not be so pleasant, Lord. My hair's kind of short. We live in a modern world where if you have a son or a daughter or grandkids that are living in Dubai, you can video chat with them in real time. I mean, that's pretty incredible. And the fact that we were able to do this, even 20 years ago, the internet could not have sustained video chat like it does now. There's just some amazing things to that.
You never had a chance to talk to Uncle Father Singer?
When we would talk, Monsignor Singer, I guess I didn't really ask him those kinds of questions. He always kept going on and on about how great Oren was and the importance of Germans from Russia. And Oren is a nice little town, but if you listen to him for very long, you'd think that Oren was pretty close to Nazareth and probably the center of the universe. And lots of you probably wonder where it is. You have to take a road north of Harvey and then take this dirt road off of the highway, and eventually you drive up to this little town that encompasses about 6 or 7 city blocks. And if you listen to some of the people in the past talk about it, this was like the giant city. It was a different world that they lived in then. So we start today with Stephen's martyrdom. That Stephen definitely has been provoking the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin, and he's up front and he's in their face. And what does he say? You are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. You stiff-necked people, you're always opposing the will of God. And they get angry at him. They get angry enough to grind their teeth. I don't know if you've ever encountered someone actually doing this, but it's kind of a disturbing thing. It happened to me once at the seminary and ended up being fairly sad. This guy was really frustrated with me, and he came into my room to talk, and he was sitting there, and I was like, what is that noise? You wonder, because it's not something you hear. Grinding your teeth is noisy. And it's a kind of anger that's intense. It's like burning and long simmering, sort of like a volcano thing. And eventually I felt bad for the guy because I was like, shoot, living with that much anger sounds kind of rough. And it takes a lot of energy to be that angry. Maybe I'm just lazy, but I don't know if it's worth it. But they're grinding their teeth at him. This is a pretty extreme form of anger. And what really sets them off is he says he sees the heavens opened and Jesus sitting at the right hand of God. I think he calls him the Son of Man, which is that unique phrase, but it probably references the book of Daniel, like the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days. There's this very divine image. I think it's in Daniel chapter 7. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees, these people in the Sanhedrin, very clearly direct him, or they understand him speaking about Jesus and calling him a divine figure. And note that this is exactly what Jesus said at his own trial before the Sanhedrin. They ask him, "Are you the Son of God?" And he says, "Yes." You know, when the high priest asks him to swear about the truth, he says, "Yes, I'm the Son of God. You will see," I think he says, "you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the Father." Now we're in the time of Stephen, and Stephen sees that. And I don't know if it's the Sanhedrin remembered the words, although one would think that you would remember that trial, that it has been stirring in their hearts for a long time, because in the trial of Jesus, it was very likely conducted in haste, in the middle of the night and early in the morning. They were out to get him. They didn't want to get caught. They didn't want the Romans to find out. His words, he had a kind of magnetism about him that, no one on earth could match. It was like people just grabbed onto him and wouldn't let go. Even the ones who opposed him, I think some of the vehemence of their opposition was because of his personal magnetism. And now Stephen's back here, and he's saying basically the same thing. Like, what they have feared more than anything else is that Jesus was right. So they cover their ears. This is kind of funny because it also doesn't work very well. If you don't believe me, wait till you have a screaming 2-year-old and just try and cover your ears. And you won't get very far. I mean, maybe if you stick cotton in them, but even good earplugs don't block out all that much noise. But they cover their ears. They don't want to hear the message. They're trying to prevent it. And in a way, it's kind of showing that they're also covering their hearts. They're closing their hearts to what he's saying. They're not willing to listen. And so they grab him, they take him in violence, they throw him out of the city, which is the same kind of thing that happened to Jesus. The crucifixion was outside the walls of ancient Jerusalem, which is also uncanny because for some of you who have been to the Holy Land, you go to Jerusalem today, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where the crucifixion happened and where the tomb was, is in the middle of the old city. It's literally in the middle of it. But that was outside the walls of the city that Jesus lived in. And so that's one of the places where you can feel the historical difference. Like, they call it the old city, but it's really not that old. It's kind of the new city compared to the really old city, which was next to it. When I was in France one time, we stayed at this Focus missionary's parents' house, and it was in the new part of town. And the new part of town was built in the 1880s, which is a little bit different than you think of the new part of town here in Fargo. So they stone him. That's the penalty for blasphemy. And one of the things that is odd about this is I think stoning someone would be rather horrible. Because you have to sort of stand there and watch it. You don't just throw a big rock and someone dies quickly. It's a process, and you'd hear things that were unpleasant. That takes a kind of hardness of heart, and I think part of the struggle in the book of Acts, I think, is to try and enter the story as much as we can and to make this feel a bit more real. Because in the life of Jesus, you have these miracles, and it's a little bit easier to think about his face and his relationship with the people and what was going on in their minds, because the stories are a little bit more bite-sized. And here in the book of Acts, it's like we've been zooming along, and there haven't been as many stories. There's just been these big speeches for the most part. That we had Peter's big speech about the Lord and Pentecost and what was happening, and Jesus is Lord and Messiah. They preach, he gets arrested, they give another speech in front of the Sanhedrin, they get beaten, and now we're at like the third speech already, and we're only in chapter 8. And so I think we have to, as I was working on the notes, I really tried to begin thinking more about the story and entering in what is happening in the lives and the hearts of these characters. One thing that I can say is that when you feel the desire to kind of cover your ears and stop listening, the opposite is probably true. That's a really good time to listen, to try and hear what someone is saying. When you think someone's completely wrong, that should sort of rise as a yellow flag in your mind. Like, well, and it's not that they're right, but that we should ask the question. We should have the openness of heart. Sometimes people say things about us that aren't what we thought, that aren't the actions that we would take. Where was I watching something? Gosh, what was it? It was just about the difference between like men and women, and there was a situation where I remember. So it was in a book, and it was about this guy that came home, this husband of Brené Brown. She writes some good books that she has a book. I think it was in Dare to Lead. And this guy came home, her husband, and was looking in their fridge and just sort of exclaims, why can't, I don't even live in a house where there's lunch meat in the refrigerator. Like, what the heck? And his wife hears that and sort of launches into this whole stream of thought about how it means she's inadequate. Like, she's not a good wife, and she can't even do things, and on and on and on. And why does he complain? He can just go buy groceries if he wants to, and it's not a big deal. And then she launches in against, so she walks out there. He didn't know that she overheard him, and she walks out there and she starts talking from the point that this conversation has happened in her head. So she's like, why do you think I'm inadequate? And he's as confused as a duck and sort of stands there, and she goes on for like 10 minutes before she finally admits that she overheard him. And he was like, it wasn't about you. And it was just, I found it horrifying, because it's like, oh my gosh, this is totally a guy moment. Like, you come home, you look at the refrigerator, you don't have what you wanted, and you're disappointed, so you say so. It's got nothing to do with anyone else on earth. It's no statement about your wife. It's no statement about how a house is kept. It's no dig against anyone. It's just a statement that there isn't meat in the refrigerator. And there was this conversation where it was like, they were talking on different ends of the earth. And for me, it's just something that I've seen so often, and it was horrifying, because it's like, oh yeah, I would totally do that as a guy. Do women actually respond like that? Like, what if you just say something? Why does it have to mean something else? That's just confusing to me. And anyway, she talked about trying to solve the problem and work through it, and she finally admitted, and she finally admitted what was going on, and she had been under lots of pressure. And her husband, she talks about like he knew her well enough to know that this was like a sign that she was really stressed and there was other things, water flowing under the bridge, so he asked about it. But a life tip for the women here, sometimes guys just say things and it doesn't mean something else. It's just a statement of fact. Just so you have that somewhere in your head. Because, I mean, sometimes maybe it really is about you or about something, but there's times where it isn't. It's just like, no, I'm tired. That's just where it's at right now. In case you were wondering. But I think it's really important to try and hear what is being said. That you don't want to respond like covering your ears or thinking that someone's totally off base or way out in left field. I mean, sometimes they are, and there's times where it's like, yeah, I'm not going to pay too much attention to this. I feel like there's too many funny Father Keller stories, but one more is worth it. I learned this lesson. We were outside the cathedral in Denver one time, and it's in an area of town that isn't the greatest area. It's actually like lots of drugs are sold on the steps of the cathedral, and it's become really trashy, and it's just where it is. It's not because anyone did anything wrong in the sense of the church. It's just that area of town has kind of been taken over, and there's a big park where people like to smoke pot and that kind of stuff, and it's really crazy. And I was standing there one day, we were visiting with this homeless person, and he started talking about something in astrophysics, and it was like, man, this guy is really smart. And then later I was like, no, that made no sense at all. I don't know if he was really smart. I think he was just sort of mentally lost. Huh. Because it didn't sound like that at first. Sometimes you meet people like that where it's like, okay, yeah, nothing this person said is really rational. It's not that important. But especially when there are critiques about us or when there are things that get pointed, and what I think the key is, now this is very much a guy thing, because you don't always realize what's going on. Like you sometimes act and then realize later like, oh yeah, there's a bunch of stuff inside of that, wasn't there? When you respond with this sort of hot flash of anger, usually it means something got poked. That's a good time, and I think this happens to all of us, but it's definitely for men more than women. Like when someone says something and all of a sudden this anger just surges up in you, like that's a good time to say, wait a minute, what just happened? What got touched? What got poked? Because there's often something that's at the root of it. That kind of emotional response, where it's like the volcano's ready to explode in 2 seconds, is usually a sign that it's your conscience at work and not the other person's fault. Like that's a sign that something has provoked a response, and that kind of drama doesn't come that quickly from other people. That's interior to us. It can get there sometimes if you leave things simmer on the stove for a while, but when you cook, despite your best efforts, no matter how hot you turn the burner, you don't have a hot pan immediately. And if you turn the burner on too high, you'll actually burn your food and it won't cook it, because you need a more gradual heat. Also why I don't care for natural gas stoves, because they never work. People say it all the time, and then it's like, yeah, it cooks the sides of my pan. I can see where the fire is. Anyway, I grew up on an electric one. But I think there's a lesson there. When you have that kind of hot flash of anger, something's up, and it's good to pay attention to. It's good to look at. And that's exactly what the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin don't do today. They don't ask the question, why does this upset us so much? What's actually going on? So they have this emotional reaction. They drag Stephen out of the Sanhedrin. They drag him out of town. They stone him and they kill him. They lay their cloaks at the feet of Saul. And this is sort of like Luke dropping a bit of breadcrumbs for you that are going to be important later. And it's like, well, who's Saul? At this point in the story, you don't actually know. He just sort of shows up. And he's angry. And they put his cloaks at his feet. And he was approving of killing this guy. Stephen calls Jesus Lord. Remember, that's one of those loaded titles that is calling Jesus God. And asks him to receive his Spirit. That's a pretty strong statement that probably enraged them even more. Because commending your spirit to someone, again, I think they would say is only for God alone. It shows that Stephen looks a lot like Jesus. He dies in the same manner, being killed for something unjust after an unjust trial. He prays for his persecutors. He prays that God would forgive them. And then he dies. He commends his spirit into the hands of the Lord. This is the beginning, then. This is the hallmark of the first persecution of Christianity. This breaks out, and some of the Christians are scattered. And it says they go to Judea and Samaria. Remember, if you look on the map, Samaria is north. It's the capital of the northern region. I put a little blurb in here in a little bit about where Samaria is and what they were and why the Jews and Samaritans weren't friends. Because I figured that some of you were probably wondering, like, who are these Samaritan people and why this animosity? So I was thinking ahead this time. It seems like the apostles remained behind in Jerusalem. And it's unclear as to why. It could be that the persecution was primarily directed against these Hellenistic Jewish believers that seemed to be compromising on the Jewish law. At least at this point, it seems like the apostles and most of the church in Jerusalem was still living in accord with Jewish law. They were still practicing and following some of the traditions of the Pharisees that they talked about, but the Hellenistic Christians weren't. But in whatever way, they start spreading out. They go maybe 50, 60 miles from Jerusalem. Samaria's to the north. Judea, one would say they're in Jerusalem, so they're in Judea, but it probably means they spread out into the hill country to the west and to the north of Judea. You don't really go to the east of Jerusalem because what's on the east side of Jerusalem? Nope, not an ocean. The mountain. Not really. The Sea of Galilee. Nope, that's way too far north. Nope. Rome is not east of Jerusalem. East of Jerusalem is the Judean wilderness and the dry land and the Jordan River Valley and the Dead Sea. It's a desert. About as deserty as deserts ever get. And it's hot, and people don't live there, except in Jericho. Why would they live in Jericho? Because there's a stream. You're close. It's not a stream. There's an oasis. There's a water source in Jericho. That's why there could be a city there. But you don't really go east of Jerusalem because there's a few hills and a few mountains left, and then it goes downhill dramatically, and it's dry as a bone. So you can go toward the Jordan River. They used that. There was a road over there, certainly, but it wasn't the kind of land that you cross unless you wanted to preach to rocks. But the apostles remain behind. They stay in Jerusalem, and it's unclear as to why. It could be divine protection. It could be a desire for stability. It could be a desire to stay where Jesus was. I kind of wonder if they went out of the city. The place of the Last Supper was either in the Essene quarter of Jerusalem, of ancient Jerusalem, or it was outside the old city walls. It was a bit further away. They might have been a bit safer out there. There were villages and towns around it. Do you have a question?
In the book, that they were, not that the Hellenists were more, that they were after the Hellenists more than the apostles were still the other type of Jewish.
The Hebrew speaking, well, they would have probably been Aramaic speaking, but yeah, they were more integrated in the Jewish community. So she points out that the book talks about the persecution being more about the Hellenists. It very well could be, but I find myself wondering a little bit. I think that's a possibility, but I would say from the text, it's harder to tell. And I'm curious as to where our authors got that, or our author, William Kurz, got that from, because it would be interesting to read about. So I don't want to discount the possibility. It's very possible that the persecution was more about Hellenistic Jews and Hellenistic Christians and people that were Gentiles and weren't living according to the law of Moses. That could be. It talks about Saul trying to destroy the church. It uses a rather strong word that means like devastation. Like, what do we call it? Unrestricted war. What's the name of it? William Sherman does it in the Civil War, where he's marching, I think, through Georgia, and he just burns everything to the ground. There's a name for it. What is that name?
Scorched, isn't it?
Scorched earth. Yeah. He's like going scorched earth about it. Like, you know, it talks about he goes into house after house after house and drags people away from their families. Again, that's a kind of intensity and vehemence that's striking. And you think about it because it's so easy to sanitize this in our minds. If that was happening to people then, it would cause a lot of fear. The people in the church would be afraid. And it's easy to be like, well, they're all saints and this all works for them. But no, I actually think that there would be a lot of fear. And they have to confront that kind of fear and decide what to do in the face of it. It also is part of this hardness of heart of the Apostle Paul. He eventually becomes Paul, but this is a pretty intense kind of hatred. This is not an easy thing. Because think about it. How many of you would have the stomach like to go into your kid's house and grab one of them by the arm and just drag them out, no matter what they said? You know, even if you would be right to do that, you know, sometimes people behave like knuckleheads and should be reminded of it. That this isn't good behavior. But think about what that would take. Even if you have to do something, you usually don't like to go to that degree. It's really not helpful most of the time to do. But this is what Paul's doing. And then it sort of jarringly just drops the story of Stephen and Saul and jumps into the story of Philip. And Philip goes to Samaria. Now, this Philip is probably the deacon Philip.